Hello people, hope you're fine, hope you're doing fine, you're maintaining the soaps. This is Mary Francis Zalwango. The other time we looked at the course of the Great Trek, how the Boers moved from the Cape Colony to the interior. We looked at the challenges they faced. So today we are going to look at the impact of the Great Trek on the people of Southern Africa. And first we shall begin with the Afrikaans. We note that the Great Trek was a turning point in the history of Southern Africa. On the part of the Afrikaans, they lost their land to the Boers. When the whites were coming in, they grabbed African land. We noted in the wars how the Ndebele were forced to move out of their land. So the Boers took over their land. The Zulu also ended up losing their land. And as the Boers were losing their land, the Africans were forced to stay into the reserves, which were overcrowded, which were diseased, and where they faced a lot of misery and suffering. And then we noted that when these Boers were coming into the interior of Southern Africa, they fought many wars. We noted about the War of Enkop, the Battle of Blood River, and as it turned out, African economies were weakened. Then African cultures were undermined as they adopted Western culture. With the increased settlement of whites into the interior of Southern Africa, many of them ended up adopting Western cultures in form of dressing, languages, and many others. And they eventually undermined their own cultures. And we also note that when the whites moved into the interior of Southern Africa, the leaders lost their power and authority to these whites. As we are noting at the battle, after the Battle of Blood River, the Dingane, who was the king of the Zulu, lost out, much as he lost out to the brother, but still the Africans no longer had the power and authority that they had had before the coming in of the whites into Southern Africa. And then we also noted that during this Great Trek, this migration, there were many wars, many conflicts with between the Africans and the Boers, and one of them was the Battle of Blood River, which was between the Zulu and the Boers, and then the Battle of Enkop between the Ndebele and the Boers. And as many of the whites settled into the interior of Southern Africa, Africans were displaced. We noted the Ndebele were displaced and were eventually to settle in modern Zimbabwe. So Africans lost their property to the Boers. For example, cattle. We note that after the defeat of Dingane, the Boers ended up grabbing most of African cattle. And then African states lost their independence to the whites. Life was never the same with the settlement of the Boers in the interior. The African states lost their independence to the whites. Then, however, some African leaders became powerful, like Mpande, who had sided with the Boers to defeat the brother Dingane, ended up getting more guns from the Boers, and the Boers, with the support of the Boers, he managed to become the new leader of the Zulu kingdom. So Mpande is one of those African leaders who became powerful. Yet there were also increased internal conflicts among Africans. We noted, for example, among the Zulu, Mpande and Dingane were brothers, but they took different sides, as one was supporting the whites, another one was in for defending the independence of the Zulu kingdom. And with the increased settlement of of whites in the interior of Southern Africa, they ended up, especially the Boers, they ended up mistreating Africans. They enslaved them, and seriously, life was miserable. And when the whites, most especially the Boers, moved into the interior, they discriminated the Africans, they segregated them, and they became second-class citizens in their own country. At the same time, these people lost their cattle and land to the whites, which led to increased poverty. Remember, in the African setting, cattle and land are symbols of wealth. But when now the white man comes in, grabs African land, grabs African cattle, to the Africans, many of them could no longer survive as life had been interrupted. Then there was increased exploitation of African labor. Remember, the Boers were coming from the Cape because of the reforms and the reforms introduced by the British, which called for the ending of enslaving of Africans. So now when they were moved into the interior where the whites were not, where the British were not following them, they ended up exploiting African labor. And with the many wars that were fought between the whites and the Africans, there was disruption of agriculture, which led to famine and food shortage. And generally, with the increased conflicts between the African societies and the whites, Africans were weakened. However, on a lighter note, there were increased trade activities between the Africans and the whites, where now Africans would exchange what they did not have with the whites. So there were increased trade activities between the two races. In conclusion, the effects of the Great Trek on the Africans were mainly negative. I'm going to leave you with that activity, and now we are going to look at how the Great Trek affected the whites. Many Boers were killed in the wars with the Africans. For example, Piet Retief, who had led the third Boer trekkers into Zululand, was eventually killed by Dingane. And as they moved into the interior, they established republics in the interior. They came up with Natal, Orange Free State, and Transvaal. It should also be noted that because the Africans were not ready for the whites, there was increased hatred between the Africans and the whites, which led to many wars. Much as we've noted that the Boers established republics in the interior, however, these republics were eventually annexed by the British. The British kept on following the Boers and ended up annexing Natal, Orange Free State, and later Transvaal. And with that annexation of these Boer republics, there was increased hatred between the Boers and the British. To the case of the Boers, they thought that we have decided to move away from the Cape, away from British domination. They did not expect the British to follow them, but when the British followed them and even annexed the republics they had established, there was increased hatred between the two white communities. And as time went by in the later years, this led to the Anglo-Boer Wars between the British and the Boers. And as they moved into the interior, the Boers enslaved the Africans. And we also note that some of those Boers who organized, who led the trekkers, eventually became the leaders. For example, Pretorius, who came up after the death of Piet Retief, managed to mobilize that third group trekkers to fight in the Battle of Blood River, and thereafter he became an important person in the politics of Southern Africa. And later also Paul Kruger came up as one of those serious Boer leaders. There was also increased Boer nationalism and desire for independence. The Boers started believing in themselves, and that's why from then on they kept on celebrating the 16th of December as a day of liberation. Remember, that was the Battle of Blood River. But we also note that much as the Africans also lost their property, the Boers also lost their property to the Africans. The Africans would steal their cattle, they would steal their wagons, they would also steal their tents, which also led to some inconveniences as they moved into the interior. But most important of all, the Great Trek opened the interior of Southern Africa to white settlement. That was the first time many whites were pushing into the interior of Southern Africa, where they were later to make many changes. We also note that as they moved into the interior, they started discriminating Africans, and this laid the basis of the apartheid policy that came into place in 1948. In conclusion, the effects of the Great Trek on the whites were both positive and negative. I'm going to leave you with that activity for you to explain the impact of the Great Trek on the whites in Southern Africa. For more information, please visit the link below. Next time, we shall look at the Boer republics formed, established by the Boers. Otherwise, I'm wishing you well. Maintain the SOPs, keep out of trouble, and see you next time. Bye.